Acres of Diamonds by Russell H. Conwell, Part 5. His Life and Achievements by Robert Shackleton. 1. The Story of the Sword. I shall write of a remarkable man, an interesting man, a man of power, of initiative, of will, of persistence. A man who plans vastly and who realizes his plans. A man who not only does things for himself, but who, ever more important than that, is the constant inspiration of others. I shall write of Russell H. Conwell. As a farmer's boy, he was the leader of the boys of the Rocky region that was his home. As a school teacher, he won devotion. As a newspaper correspondent, he gained fame. As a soldier in the Civil War, he rose to important rank. As a lawyer, he developed a large practice. As an author, he wrote books that reached a mighty total of sales. He left the law for the ministry and is the active head of a great church that he raised from nothingness. He is the most popular lecturer in the world and yearly speaks to many thousands. He is, so to speak, the discoverer of Acres of Diamonds, through which thousands of men and women have achieved success out of failure. He is the head of 2 hospitals, one of them founded by himself, that have cared for a host of patients, both the poor and the rich, irrespective of race or creed. He is the founder and head of a university that has already had tens of thousands of students. His home is in Philadelphia, but he is known in every corner of every state of the Union, and everywhere he has hosts of friends. All his life he has helped and inspired others. Quite by chance, and only yesterday, literally yesterday and by chance, and with no thought of the moment of Conwell, although he had been much in my mind for some time past, I picked up a thin little book of description by William Dean Howells, and turning the pages of a chapter on Lexington, old Lexington of the Revolution, written, so Howells had set down, in 1882, I noticed after he had written of the town itself, and of the long past fight there, and of the present day aspect, that he mentioned the church life of the place and remarked on the striking advances made by the Baptists, who had lately, as he expressed it, been reconstituted out of very perishing fragments and made strong and flourishing under the ministrations of a lay preacher, formerly a colonel in the Union Army. And it was only a few days before I chanced upon this description that Dr. Conwell, the former colonel and former lay preacher, had told me of his experiences in that little old revolutionary town. Howells went on to say that, so he was told, the colonel's success was principally due to his making the church attractive to young people. Howells says no more of him. Apparently he did not go out to hear him, and one wonders if he had ever associated that lay preacher of Lexington with the famous Russell H. Conwell of these recent years. Attractive to young people. Yes, one can recognize that today, just as it was recognized in Lexington, and it may be added that he, at the same time, attracts older people too. In this, indeed, lies his power. He makes his church interesting, his sermons interesting, his lectures interesting. He is himself interesting. Because of his being interesting, he gains attention. The attention gained, he inspires. Biography is more than dates. Dates, after all, are but milestones along the real road of life. And the most important fact from Conwell's life is that he lived to be 82, working 16-hour days every day for the good of his fellow man. He was born on February 15, 1843, born of poor parents in a low-roofed cottage in the eastern Berkshires in Massachusetts. I was born in this room, he said to me simply as we sat together recently, in front of the old fireplace in the principal room of the little cottage, for he has bought back the rocky farm of his father and has retained and restored the little old home. I was born in this room. It was bedroom and kitchen. It was poverty. And his voice sank with the kind of grimness into silence. Then he spoke a little of the struggles of those long past years, and we went out to the porch as the evening shadow fell. He looked out over the valley and stream and hills of his youth, and he told of his grandmother and of a young Marylander who had come to the region on a visit. It was the tale of the impetuous love of those two, of rash marriage, of the interference of parents, of the fierce rivalry of another suitor, of an attack on the Marylander's life, of passionate hastiness and unforgivable words, of separation, of lifelong sorrow. Why does grandmother cry so often, he remembers, asking when he was a little boy, and he was told it was for the husband of her youth. We went back into the little house, and he showed me the room in which he first saw John Brown. I came down early one morning and saw a huge hairy man sprawled upon the bed there, and I was frightened, he says. But John Brown did not long frighten him, for he was much at their home after that, and was so friendly with Russell and his brother that there was no chance for awe. And it gives a curious sidelight on the character of the stern abolitionist that he actually, with infinite patience, taught the old horse of the Conwells to go home along with the wagon after leaving the boys at school a mile or more away, and at school closing time to trot gently off for them without a driver, when merely faced in that direction and told to go. Conwell remembers how John Brown, in training it, used patiently to walk beside the horse and control its going and turning until it was quite ready to go and turn by itself. The Conwell house was a station on the Underground Railroad, and Russell Conwell remembers when a lad seeing the escaping slaves that his father had driven across the country and temporarily hidden. Those were heroic days, he says quietly, and once in a while my father let me go with him. They were wonderful night drives, the cowering slaves, the darkness of the road, the caution and silence and dread of it all. This underground route, he remembers, was from Philadelphia to New Haven, thence to Springfield, where Conwell's father would take his charge, and onward the Bellows Falls and Canada. Conwell tells, too, of meeting Frederick Douglass, the colored orator, in that little cottage on the hills. I never saw my father, Douglass said one day. His father was a white man, and I remember little of my mother, except that once she tried to keep an overseer from whipping me, and the lash cut across her own face, and her blood fell over me. When John Brown was captured, Conwell went on, my father tried to sell this place to get a little money to send to help his defense, but he couldn't sell it, and on the day of the execution, we knelt solemnly here from 11 to 12, just praying in silence for the passing soul of John Brown. And as we prayed, we knew that others were praying, for the church bell tolled during that entire hour, and its awesome boom went sadly sounding over these hills. Conwell believes that his real life dates from a happening of the time of the Civil War, a happening that still looms vivid and intense before him, of which undoubtedly did deepen and strengthen his strong and deep nature. Yet the real Conwell was always essentially the same. Neighborhood tradition still tells of his bravery as a boy and a youth, of reckless coasting, his skill as a swimmer, and saving of lives, his strength and endurance, his plunging out into the darkness of wild winter night to save a neighbor's cattle. His soldiers came home with tales of his devotion to them, and how he shared his rations and his blankets and bravely risked his life, of how he crept off into a swamp at imminent peril to rescue one of the men lost or mired there. The present Conwell was always Conwell. In fact, he may be traced through his ancestry too, for in him there are sturdy virtues, the bravery, the grim determination, the practicality of his father, and romanticism that comes from his grandmother, and the dreamy qualities of his mother, who, practical and hard-working New England woman that she was the same time influenced by an almost startling mysticism. And Conwell himself is a dreamer. First of all, he is a dreamer. It is the most important fact in regard to him. It is because he is a dreamer and visualizes his dreams that he can plan the great things that to other men would seem impossibilities. And then his intensely practical side, his intense efficiency, his power, his skill, his patience, his fine earnestness, his mastery over others, develop his dreams into reality. He dreams dreams and sees visions, but his visions are never visionary, and his dreams become fact. The Rocky Hills, which meant a dogged struggle for very existence. The fugitive slaves, John Brown, what a school for youth. And that literal school was a tiny one-room schoolhouse where young Conwell came under the care of a teacher who realized the boy's unusual capabilities and was able to give him broad and unusual help. Then a wise country preacher also recognized the unusual and urged the parents to give still more education, whereupon supreme effort was made and young Russell was sent to Wilbraham Academy. He likes to tell of his life there and of the hardships of which he makes light, and of the joy with which weekend pies and cakes were received from home. He tells of how he went out on the road selling books from house to house, and how eagerly he devoured the contents of the sample books that he carried. They were the foundation of learning for me, he says soberly, and they gave me a broad idea of the world. He went to Yale in 1860, but the outbreak of the war interfered with college, and he enlisted in 1861. But he was only 18, and his father objected, and he went back to Yale. But next year he again enlisted, and the men of his Berkshire neighborhood, likewise enlisting, insisted that he be their captain. And Governor Andrews, appealed to, consented to commission of the 19-year-old youth, who was so evidently a natural leader, and the man gave freely of their scant money to get for him a sword, all gay and splendid with gilt upon the sword. Was the declaration in stately Latin that true friendship is eternal, and with that sword is associated the most vivid and momentous experience of Russell Conwell's life. The sword hangs at the head of Conwell's bed in his home in Philadelphia. Man of peace that he is, and minister of peace, that symbol of war has for over half a century been of infinite importance to him. He told me the story as we stood together before that sword. And he has told the story, speaking with quiet repression, but seeing it all and living it all just as vividly as if it had occurred but yesterday. That sword has meant so much to me, he murmured, and then he began to tell. A boy up there in the Berkshires, a neighbor's son, was John Ring. I call him a boy, for we all called him a boy, and we looked upon him as a boy. He was undersized and underdeveloped, so much that he could not enlist. But for some reason he was devoted to me, and he not only wanted to enlist, but he wanted to be in the artillery company of which I was captain. And I could only take him along as my servant. I didn't want a servant, but it is the only way I could take along poor little Johnny Ring. Johnny was deeply religious and would read the Bible every evening before turning in. In those days I was an atheist, or at least thought I was, and I used to laugh at Ring, and after a while he took to reading the Bible outside the tent on account of my laughing at him. But he could not stop reading it, and his faithfulness to me remained unchanged. The scabbard of the sword was too glistening for the regulations. The ghost of the smile hovered on Conwell's lips, and I could not wear it. I could only wear a plain one for service, and keep this hanging in my tent on a tent pole. John Ring used to handle it adoringly and kept it polished to brilliancy. It's dull enough, these many years, he added somberly. To Ring it represented not only his captain, but the very glory and pomp of war. One day the Confederates suddenly stormed our position near New Bern and swept through the camp, driving our entire force before them, and all, including my company, retreated hurriedly across the river, setting fire to a long wooden bridge as we went over. As soon as it blazed up furiously, making a barrier that the Confederates could not pass. But unknown to everybody and unnoticed, John Ring had dashed back to my tent. I think he was able to make his way back because he looked like a mere boy, but however that was, He got past the Confederates into my tent and took down from where it was hanging on the tent pole my bright gold-scabbarded sword. John Ring seized the sword that had been so long precious to him. He dodged here and there and actually managed to gain the bridge just as it was beginning to blaze. He started across. The flames were every moment getting fiercer, the smoke denser, and now and then, as he crawled and staggered on, he leaned for a few seconds far over the edge of that bridge in an effort to get air. Both sides saw him, and both sides watched his terrible progress, even while firing was fiercely kept up from either side of the river. And then a Confederate officer, he was one of General Pickett's officers, ran to the water's edge and waved a white handkerchief, and the firing ceased. "Tell that boy to come back here," he cried. "Tell him to come back here, and I will let him go free." He called out just as Ring was about to enter upon the worst part of the bridge, the covered part, where there were top and bottom and sides of blazing wood. The roar of the flame was so close to Ring that he could not hear the calls from either side of the river, and he pushed desperately on and disappeared into the cover part. There was dead silence except for the crackling of the fire. Not a man cried out. All waited in hopeless expectancy, and then came a mighty yell from Northerner and Southerner alike, for Johnny came crawling out of the end of the covered way. He had actually passed through that frightful place, and his clothes were ablaze, and he toppled over and fell into the shallow water, and a few minutes later he was dragged out unconscious and hurried to a hospital. He lingered for a day or two, still unconscious, and then came to himself and smiled a little and found that the sword, for which he had given his life, had been left beside him. He took it in his arms. He hugged it to his breast and gave a few words of the final message to me, and that was all. Conwell's voice had gone thrillingly low as he neared the end, for it was all so very, very vivid to him, and his eyes had grown tender and his lips more strong and firm. And he fell silent, thinking of that long-ago happening, and though he looked down upon the thronging traffic of Broad Street, it was clear that he did not see it, and that if the rumbling hubbub of sound meant anything to him, it was the rumbling of the guns of the distant past. When we spoke again, it was with a still tenser tone of feeling. When I stood beside the body of John Ring and realized that he had died for the love of me, I made a vow that has formed my life. I vowed that from that moment I would live not only my own life, but I would also live the life of John Ring, and from that moment I have worked 16 hours every day, 8 for John Ring's work and 8 for my own. A curious note had come into his voice, as one of who had run into the race, neared the goal, fought the good fight, and neared the end. Every morning when I rise I look at this sword, or if I'm away from home I think of the sword and vow anew that another day shall see 16 hours of work from me. And when one comes to know Russell Conwell, one knows that never did a man work so hard and consistently. It was through John Ring and his giving of his life through devotion to me that I became a Christian, he went on. This did not come about immediately, but it came before the war was over, and it came through the faithful Johnny Ring. There was a little lonely cemetery in the Berkshires, a tiny burying ground on a windswept hill a few miles from Conwell's old home. In this isolated burying ground, bushes and vines and grass grow in profusion, and a few trees cast a gentle shade, and the tree-clad hills go a-billowing off for miles and miles in wild and lovely beauty. And in that lovely little graveyard I found a plain stone that marks the resting place of John Ring. End of Part 5. Acres of Diamonds by Russell H. Conwell, Part 6. 2. The Beginning at Old Lexington. It was not because he was a minister that Russell Conwell is such a force in the world. He went into the ministry because he was sincerely and profoundly a Christian, and because he felt that as a minister he could do more good in the world than in any other capacity. But being a minister is but an incident, so to speak. The important thing is not that he is a minister, but that he is himself. Recently, I heard a New Yorker, the head of a great corporation, say, "I believe that Russell Conwell is doing more good in this world than any man who has lived since Jesus Christ." And he said this in a serious and unexaggerated earnest. Yet Conwell did not readily get into his life work. He might have seemed almost a failure until he was well on toward 40. For although he kept making successes, they were not permanent successes, and he did not settle himself into a definite line. He restlessly went westward to make his home, and then restlessly returned to the east. After the war was over, he was a lawyer, he was a lecturer, he was an editor. He went around the world as a correspondent. He wrote books. He kept making money and kept losing it. He lost it through fire, through investments, through aiding his friends. It is probable that the unsettledness of the years following the war was due to the unsettling effect of the war itself, which thus in its influence broke into his mature life after breaking into his years at Yale. But however this may be, those seething, changing, stirring years were years of vital importance to him. For in the myriad experiences of that time he was building the foundation of the Conwell that was to come. Abroad he met the notables of the earth. At home he made hosts of friends and loyal admirers. It was worth noting that as a lawyer he would never take a case, either civil or criminal, that he considered wrong. It was basic with him that he could not and would not fight if he thought he was on the wrong side. Only when his client was right would he go ahead. Yet he laughs, his quiet, infectious, characteristic laugh, as he tells of how once he was deceived, for he defended a man charged with stealing a watch, who was so obviously innocent that he took the case in a blaze of indignation and had the fellow proudly exonerated. The next day the wrongly accused one came to his office and shamefully took out the watch which he had been charged with stealing. "I want to send it to the man I took it from," he said, and he told with a sort of shamefaced pride of how he had gotten the good old deacon to give in all sincerity the evidence which exculpated him. "And," say Mr. Conwell, "I want to thank you for getting me off. I hope you'll excuse my deceiving you, and I won't be any worse for not going to jail." And Conwell likes to remember that thereafter the young man lived up the pride of exoneration, and though Conwell does not say it or think it, one knows that it was the Conwell influence that inspired to honesty, for always he is the inspirer. Conwell even kept certain hours for consultation with those too poor to pay any fee, and at one time, while still an active lawyer, he was guardian for over 60 children. The man has always been a marvel, and always one to come upon such romantic facts as these. That it was a curious thing about him, how much there was of romance in his life. Worship to the End by John Ring, left for dead all night at Kennesaw Mountain, calmly singing "Nearer, My God, to Thee," to quiet the passengers on a supposedly sinking ship. Saving lives even when a boy, never disappointing a single audience of thousands of audiences he has arranged to address during all his years of lecturing. He himself takes little pride in this last point, and it is a characteristic of him that he has actually forgotten that just once he did fail to appear. He was quite forgotten that one evening, on his way to a lecture, he stopped a runaway horse to save 2 women's lives, and went in consequence to the hospital instead of the platform. And it was typical of him to forget that sort of thing. The emotional temperament of Conwell has always made him responsive to the great, the striking, the patriotic. He was deeply influenced by knowing John Brown, and his brief memories of Lincoln are intense, though he saw him but 3 times in all. The first time he saw Lincoln was on the night when the future president delivered his address, which afterwards became so famous, in Cooper Union, New York. The name of Lincoln was then scarcely known, and it was by mere chance that young Conwell happened to be in New York on that day. But being there and learning that Abraham Lincoln from the West was going to make an address, he went to hear him. He tells how uncouthly Lincoln was dressed, even with one trouser's leg higher than the other, and of how awkward he was, and of how poorly at first he spoke, and with what apparent embarrassment the chairman of the meeting got Lincoln a glass of water, and Conwell thought it was from the personal desire to help him and keep him from breaking down. But he loves to tell how Lincoln became a changed man as he spoke, how he seemed to feel ashamed of his brief embarrassment, and pulling himself together and putting aside the written speech which he had prepared, spoke freely and powerfully, with splendid conviction, as only a born orator speaks. To Conwell it was a tremendous experience. The second time he saw Lincoln was when he went to Washington to plead for the life of one of his men who had been condemned to death for sleeping on post. He was still a captain. His promotion to the colonelcy was still to come. A youth, and was awed by going into the presence of a man he worshipped, and his voice trembles a little even now as he tells how pleasantly Lincoln looked up from his desk, and how cheerfully he asked his business with him, and how absorbedly Lincoln then listened to his tale. So it appeared he already knew of the main outline. "It will be all right," said Lincoln when Conwell finished. But Conwell was still frightened. He feared that in the municipality of public matters, this mere matter of the life of a mountain boy, a private soldier, might be forgotten till too late. "It's almost the time set," he faltered, and Conwell's voice almost breaks, man of emotion that he is, to tell how Lincoln said with stern gravity, "Go and telegraph that soldier's mother that Abraham Lincoln never signed a warrant to shoot a boy under 20 and never will." That was the one and only time that he spoke with Lincoln, and it remains an indelible impression. The third time he saw Lincoln was when, as officer of the day, he stood for hours beside the dead body of the president as it lay in state in Washington. In those hours he stood rigidly as the throng went shuffling sorrowfully through. An immense impression came to Colonel Conwell of the work and worth of the man who lay there dead, and that impression has never departed. John Brown, Abraham Lincoln, old Revolutionary Lexington. How Conwell's life is associated with famous men and places. And it was actually at Lexington that he made the critical decision as to the course of his life. And it seems to me that it was, although quite unconsciously, because of the very fact that it was Lexington, that Conwell was influenced to decide and to act as he did. Had it been some other kind of place, some merely ordinary place, some quite usual place, he might not have taken that important step. But it was Lexington. It was brave old Lexington, inspiring Lexington, and he was inspired by it. For the man himself inspires nobly is always the one who upon himself is open to noble inspiration. Lexington inspired him. "When I was a lawyer in Boston, and almost 37 years old," he told me, thinking slowly back into the years, "I was consulted by a woman who asked my advice in regards to disposing of a little church in Lexington whose congregation had become unable to support it. I went out and looked at the place and told her how the property could be sold, but it seemed a pity to me that the church should be given up. However, I advised a meeting of church members, and I attended the meeting. I put the case to them. It was only a handful of men and women, and there was silence for a little. Then a little old man rose in a quivering voice, said the matter was quite clear, that there evidently was nothing to do but sell, and he would agree with the others in the necessity. But as the church had been his church home from boyhood, so he quivered and quivered on. He begged that they would excuse him from actually taking part in disposing of it, and in a deep silence he went haltingly out of the room. The men and women looked at one another, still silent, sadly impressed, but not knowing what to do, and I said to them, why not start over again and go on with the church after all? Typical Conwellian, that. First the impulse to help those who needs helping, then the inspiration and leadership. But the building is entirely too tumble down to use, said one of the men, sadly, and I knew it was right, for I had examined it. But I said, let us meet tomorrow morning and get to work on building ourselves and put it in shape for the service next Sunday. It made them seem pleased and encouraged, and so confident that a new possibility was opening, that I never doubted that each one of those present, and many friends besides, would be at the building in the morning. I was there early with a hammer and axe and crowbar I had secured, ready to go to work, but no one else showed up. He has a rueful appreciation of the humor of it, as he pictured the scene, and one knows also that in that little town of Lexington, where Americans had so bravely faced the impossible, Russell Conwell also braced himself to face the impossible. A pettier man would have instantly given up the entire matter when those who were most interested failed to respond. But one of the strongest features in the Conwell character is his ability to draw even doubters and weaklings into line, his ability to stir even those who have given up. I looked over that building, he goes on whimsically, and I saw that repair really seemed out of the question. Nothing but a new church would do. So I took the axe that I had brought with me and began chopping the place down. In a little while, a man, not one of the church members, came along, and he watched me for a time and said, "What are you going to do there?" I instantly replied, "Tear down this old building and build a new church here." He looked at me. "But the people won't do that," he said. "Yes, they will," I said cheerfully, keeping at my work, whereupon he watched me a few minutes longer and said, "Well, you can put me down for $100 for the new building. Come up to my livery stable and get it this evening." "All right, I'll surely be there," I replied. In a little while another man came along and stopped and looked, and he rather jibbed at the idea of a new church. And when I told him of the livery stable man contributing $100, he said, "But you haven't got the money yet." "No," I said, "but I'm going to get it tonight." "You'll never get it," he said. He's not that sort of a man. He's not even a churchman. But I just went quietly on with the work without answering, and after a while he left, but he called back as he went off, "Well, if he does give you that $100, come to me and I'll give you another 100. Conwell smiles in genial reminiscence and without any apparent sense that he is telling of a great personal triumph, and goes on. Those two men both paid the money, and of course the church people themselves, who at first not quite understood that I could be in earnest, and joined in and helped with work and money, and while the new church was building, it was peculiarly important to get and to keep the congregation together, as they had ceased to have a minister of their own. I used to run out from Boston and preach for them in a room we hired, and it was there in Lexington in 1879 that I determined to become a minister. I had had a good law practice, but I determined to give it up. For many years I had felt more or less the call to ministry, and here at length was the definite time to begin. Week by week I preached there. How strange now to think of William Dean Howells and the Colonel Preacher. And after a while the church was completed, and in that very church there in Lexington I was ordained a minister. A marvelous thing, all this, even without considering the marvelous heights that Conwell has since attained. A marvelous thing, an achievement of positive romance. That little church stood for American bravery and initiative and self-sacrifice and romanticism in a way that well befitted good old Lexington. To leave a large and overflowing law practice and take up the ministry at a salary of $600 a year seemed to the relatives of Conwell's wife the extreme of foolishness, and they did not hesitate to express themselves. Naturally enough, they did not have Conwell's vision. Yet he himself was fair enough to realize and to admit there was a good deal of fairness in their objections, and so he said to the congregation that he was quite ready to come for $600 a year. He expected them to double his salary as soon as he doubled the church membership. That seemed to them a good deal like a joke, but they answered in perfect earnestness that they would be quite willing to do the doubling as soon as he did the doubling, and in less than a year his salary was doubled accordingly. I asked him if he found it hard to give up the lucrative law for a poor ministry, and his reply gave a delightful impression of his capacity for humorous insight into human nature, for he said with a genial twinkle, "Oh, yes, it was a wrench, but there was sort of a romance of self-sacrifice, you know. I rather suppose the old-time martyrs rather enjoyed themselves in being martyrs." Conwell did not stay very long in Lexington. A struggling little church in Philadelphia heard what he was doing, and so an old deacon went up to see and hear him, and an invitation was given. And as the Lexington church seemed so prosperously on its feet, and the needs of the Philadelphia body keenly appealed to Conwell's imagination, a change was made, and at a salary of $800 a year he went, in 1882, to a little struggling Philadelphia congregation, and of the congregation he is still pastor, only it ceased to be a struggling congregation a great many years ago, and long ago it began paying him more thousands every year than it first gave him hundreds. Dreamer as Conwell is, in conjunction with his immense practicality and moved as he is by the spiritual influences of life, it is more than likely that not only did Philadelphia's need appeal, but also the fact that Philadelphia as a city meant so much to him. Coming north, wounded from the battlefield of the Civil War, it was Philadelphia that he has cared for until his health and strength recovered. Thus it came that Philadelphia had early become dear to him. And here is an excellent example of how dreaming great dreams may go hand in hand with winning superb results. For that little struggling congregation now owns and occupies a great new church building that seats more people than any other Protestant church in America, and Dr. Conwell fills it. 3. Story of the 57 cents. At every point in Conwell's life, one sees that he wins through his wonderful personal influence on old and young. Every step forward, every triumph achieved, comes not alone from his own enthusiasm, but because of his putting that enthusiasm into others. And when I learned how it came that the present church buildings were begun, it was another one of those marvelous tales of fact that are stranger than any imagination could make them. And yet the tale was so simple and sweet and sad and unpretending. When Dr. Conwell first assumed charge of that little congregation that led him to Philadelphia, it was really a little church, both in its numbers and in the size of the building it occupied. But it quickly became so popular under his leadership that the church services and Sunday school services were alike so crowded that there was no room for all who came, and always there were people turned from the doors. One afternoon a little girl, who had eagerly wished to go, turned back from the Sunday school door, crying bitterly because they had told her that there was no more room. But a tall, black-haired man met her and noticed her tears, and stopping, asked why she was crying, and sobbingly she replied that it was because they could not let her into Sunday school. I lifted her to my shoulder, says Dr. Conwell in telling of this, and after hearing the story elsewhere, I asked him to tell it to me himself, for it seemed almost too strange to be true. I lifted her to my shoulder, and one realizes the pretty scene it must have made for the little girl to go through the crowd of people, drying her tears and riding proudly upon the shoulders of this kindly, tall, dark man. I said to her that I would like to take her in a room big enough for all who came. I said to her that I would take her in, and I did so, and I said to her that we should some day have a room big enough for all who should come. And when she went home, she told her parents, I only learned this afterwards, that she was going to save money to help build the larger church and Sunday school that Dr. Conwell wanted. Her parents pleasantly humored her in the idea and let her run errands and do little tasks to earn pennies, and she began dropping pennies into her bank. She was a lovable little thing, but in only a few weeks after that she had taken suddenly ill and died, and at the funeral her father told me quietly of how his little girl had been saving money for a building fund, and there at the funeral handed me what she had saved, just 57 cents in pennies. Dr. Conwell does not say how deeply he was moved after this. After all, a man of very few words as to his own emotions, but a deep tenderness had swept into his voice. At the meeting of the church trustees, I told of this gift of 57 cents, this first gift toward the proposed building fund of the new church that was some time to exist. For until then the matter had barely been spoken of, as the new church building had simply been a possibility for the future. The trustees seemed much impressed, and it turned out that they were far more impressed than I possibly could have hoped. For in a few days one of them came to me and said that he thought it would be an excellent idea to buy a lot on Broad Street, the very lot in which the building now stands. It was characteristic of Dr. Conwell that he did not point out what everyone would understand, that it was his own inspiration to put into the trustees which resulted in this quick and definite move on the part of one of them. I talked the matter over with the owner of the property and told him of the beginning of the fund, the story of the little girl. The man was not one of our church, nor, in fact, was he a churchgoer at all, but he had listened attentively to the tale of the 57 cents and simply said he was quite ready to go ahead and sell us that piece of land for $10,000. Taking, and the unexpectedness of this deeply touched me, taking the first payment of just 57 cents and letting the entire building stand on a 5% mortgage. And it seemed to me that it would be the right thing to accept this unexpectedly liberal proposition, and I went over the entire matter on that basis with the trustees and some of the other members, and all of the people would soon be talking of having a new church. But it was not done in that way, after all, for fine though that way would have been, there was one still finer. Not long after my talk with the man who owned the land, his surprisingly good-hearted proposition, an exchange was arranged for me one evening with a Mount Holly church, and my wife went with me. We came back late, and it was cold and wet and miserable. But as we approached our home, we saw that it was all lighted from top to bottom, and there it was clear that it was full of people. I said to my wife that they seemed to be having a better time than we had had, and we went in, curious to know what this was all about. And as it turned out, in our absence, which had been intentionally arranged, that the church people had gathered in our home to meet us on our return, and we were utterly amazed, for the spokesman told me that the entire $10,000 had been raised, and that the land for the church that I wanted was free of debt, and all had come so quickly and directly from this dear little girl's 57 cents. Didn't it seem like a fairy tale? But then this man has all his life been making fairy tales into realities. He inspired the child, he inspired the trustees, he inspired the owner of the land, he inspired the people. The building of this great church, the Temple Baptist Church, as it is termed, was a great undertaking for the congregation, even though it had been swiftly growing from the day of Dr. Conwell's taking charge of it. It was something far ahead of what, except for the eyes of the enthusiast, that they could possibly complete and pay for and support. Nor was it an easy task. Ground was broken for the building in 1889. In 1891, it was opened for worship. Then came years of raising money to clear it. But it was long ago placed completely out of debt, and with only a single large subscription, one of $10,000 for the church, is not in a wealthy neighborhood, nor is the congregation made up of the great and rich. The church is built of stone, and its interior is a great amphitheater. Special attention has been given to the fresh air and light. There is nothing of the dim religious light that goes on with medieval churchliness. Behind the pulpit are tiers of seats for the great chorus choir. There is a large organ. The building is peculiarly adapted for hearing and seeing, and if it is not, strictly speaking, beautiful in itself, it is beautiful when it is filled with encircling rows of men and women, men of feeling, that is, and one who appreciates the importance of symbols. Dr. Conwell had a heart of olive wood built into the front of the pulpit, for the wood was from the olive tree in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the amber-colored tiles in the inner wall of the church bear under their glaze the names of thousands of his people, every one, young and old, who helped the building, even to the giving of a single dollar, has his name inscribed there. For Dr. Conwell wished to show that it is not only the house of the Lord, but also, in a keenly personal sense, the house of those who build it. The church has a possible seating capacity of 4,200, although only 3,135 chairs have been put into it, for it is the desire not to crowd the space needlessly. There is also a great room for Sunday school, and extensive rooms for the Young Men's Association, the Young Women's Association, and for a kitchen, for executive offices, for meeting places for church officers, and boards and committees. It is a spacious and practical and complete church home, and many people feel at home there. You see again, said Dr. Conwell musingly, The advantage of aiming at big things. That building represents $109,000 above ground. It is free from debt. Had we built a small church, it would now be heavily mortgaged. End of part 6.